Good morning and welcome everyone to the International Nature Finance Exploration Zone webinar on the Voluntary Carbon Market. I'm Julia Clough, I'm the Project Development Officer at the Scottish Forum for Natural Capital. This is a review of the key developments in the voluntary carbon markets in 2023 and at COP28. And we're going to have a look at what to look out for in 2024. So just a bit of background, this is an exploration zone, and these zones have grown out of discussions developed in the Nature Finance Pioneers Base Camp, and it's a space to build connections for Scotland across current international ecosystem market activities. We're going to be signposting to initiatives and nature finance mechanisms to help increase knowledge and understanding of what works and perhaps what doesn't work. These exploration zones are being piloted as pop-up discussion spaces to explore a specific element within the topic hubs in more detail. And they're very kindly led by members of the network. So thanks to Matt and Julia McCarthy for leading the International Nature Finance Exploration Zone. We're open to ideas for new exploration zones. I'll pop more details in the chat in a moment. And if you're new to the base camp, if you haven't signed up to the base camp, I'll pop the link to the sign up in the chat as well. So our speaker today is Matt Gledhill. He's a Carbon Markets Analyst at a Nature-Based Solutions project developer, and he's working on developing market-based solutions for wildlife conservation that drive measurable and sustainable development. So without further ado, I'll hand over. Thanks, Matt.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Julia. So thanks everybody for coming. As Julia mentioned, so I'm working at a nature-based solutions project developer that sells carbon credits on the voluntary carbon market. So that does mean that I come with some biases. So I will try and be objective as possible when we're going through this. Feel free to pop any questions in the chat or pop your hand up, and we'll just come to them as they pop up. So it's more of a discussion than a kind of webinar type format. And with that, we'll get going. So I'm sure many of you will remember the beginning of last year, 2023. One of the key developments was the publication of the Guardian news story, where they wrote that 19% of carbon offsets were worthless. And this media criticism of the market kind of carried on throughout the year, and that was a real pattern throughout the whole year. Predominantly, the criticism was focused on projects that sell reduction credits. And so these projects require baselines from which to credit, and so that's where you can kind of get a lot of contested baselines. A bit of my bias will come out here. I would just say that there are some people who kind of questioned the science, the study that was used by the Guardian, including some professors from the University of Edinburgh. So there's more of a nuance to this discussion than the headline probably implies. But this had a big impact on the market, and you can see that on the bottom right chart. That's the price for RED+ carbon credits from the spot market, so sold on the secondary market, and it went from pretty, the story was published in January, and you see that big drop, and that carried on pretty much throughout the whole year. It's not really recovered since. But that is not true of all projects. So blue carbon, which is remained popular throughout the year, but not much supply. You see their prices there stayed, actually rose above the levels that they were in January 2023. So the impact on the market as a whole was it kind of stagnated. The market size remained roughly the same at $2 billion. And the number of retirements, so carbon credits that are used, also remained flat, 180 million. And this raised the issue of trust, which is an issue, trust in the market, which is an issue that the market's been trying to, or it's been trying to work on and address since Glasgow, COP26. And there are two parts to this. So there's the supply side integrity and this organization called the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. And this was funded by the UK government and a few other institutions. But essentially what this initiative does is it establishes what have been known as the core carbon principles, which are those 10 listed there. So you can see the 10 there. And it does include sustainable development as well as carbon related principles as well. And the Integrity Council will then assess against two levels. They will assess program assessments. So for instance, in Vera, or in the UK's case, maybe the Woodland Carbon Code. And it will then also assess the methodologies that are within those standards. So for Vera, that's a lot of different methodologies. And if the methodology passes that assessment, that methodology can then issue carbon credits, which have this core carbon principle label. So it's kind of like a bolt-on to your normal carbon credit. They won't assess individual projects. It will just be, kind of on that methodology and category level that happens. Sorry, I think there's someone trying to speak, or if not, and these labels are expected to bring a bit of a price premium, but they're also probably going to be a kind of a minimum criteria for some buyers when they do their due diligence. And while this is in development, that's kind of meant that some buyers have paused until these core carbon principle labeled carbon credits become available. Here's a kind of rough overview of the assessments. So you see that's the program level, the standard level, and then they have the category level. What's interesting is that they're fast tracking methodologies they think are going to kind of easily meet the core carbon principles, and then they have a longer process for more complex project types. So Red Plus, for instance, will be a project type that goes through a much longer process before they decide whether it can issue core carbon principles certified credits. So that's on the supply side integrity, if you like. Then on the demand side, there is what's called the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, VCMI. And again, this is funded as well by the UK government as well, or has been funded by the UK government, but it's an international initiative. And what they're doing is they're developing a claims code of practice, which polices is the wrong word. It just tells companies what they can say about the use of carbon credits, and then certifies those that follow best practice criteria. So this is kind of part of the counter to the argument that carbon credits are a kind of an excuse to pollute and carry on business as usual. The VCMI has these foundational criteria that you recognize as kind of the first parts of the mitigation hierarchy. So companies have to be disclosing and reporting on their emissions, and they have to have targets, interim and also a net zero target by 2050 at the latest. And the company also has to demonstrate that it's aligned to kind of the global net zero journey. So those advocacy activities are aligned to the Paris Agreement. It's not lobbying against climate action and that kind of thing. And so if a company can show that it's doing those, it can then make a claim under the claims code of practice. But it also has to demonstrate that it is on track to meet its climate targets. So its emissions are reducing year on year in line with its targets. Companies can then buy carbon credits that are, if we go back a couple of slides, core carbon principle certified, or the equivalent while there's no supply. And then depending on the percentage of their remaining emissions they buy carbon credits the equivalent of, they can make these claims. So platinum is the highest, gold the middle, and then silver the lowest. But the key part of this is the emissions have got to reduce year on year, and it is scope 1 to 3 emissions that have to reduce year on year. And so that is really challenging for a lot of companies at the moment. And I think some people have looked at how many companies could feasibly make one of these claims, and it's in the single-digit percentages of companies that have climate targets. So they're looking at a way of kind of making more flexible and temporary claim that allows a bit more flexibility around scope 3. So those are the two supply and demand integrity initiatives. They've been kind of ongoing since COP26, and they really came to fruition last year as they developed their work plan. And that led in part to some of the kind of, despite all the negative press that the voluntary carbon market got throughout last year, there was a kind of surprising amount of optimism at COP28 about the role of the voluntary carbon market. They had pretty vocal backing from some political heavyweights. So on the right, you see that quote by John Kerry about how he's become a firm believer in the power of the voluntary carbon market, the role of the voluntary carbon market. The UK announced that it was going to endorse both the Integrity Council and the Voluntary Carbon Market Initiative, so the supply and demand integrity initiatives. And not really a positive, but there's a lack of agreement still at the international carbon trading level, which has kind of left a gap for the voluntary carbon markets to fill. Until that gap it kind of gets filled. That's a very different conversation about how companies can partake in kind of a carbon compliance carbon market. Maybe one that we can look at in the future international zone. Cool. But also at COP28, we saw some of these market shapers, including the two we've spoken about, increase the way or increase the kind of consistency of the guidance that's out there for companies. So what are known as the meta standards committed to this end-to-end integrity initiative we see on the right-hand side. And they were working on this end-to-end integrity initiative. So that's everything from, the greenhouse gas emission protocol, which is how companies measure their emissions. Science-based target initiative, how companies set climate targets, and then the climate disclosures project, which is how companies report and disclose on their emissions and their emission reductions. So that's the kind of the core tenets of the company's decarbonisation journey. And then once those are in place, then you get to the use of carbon credits as kind of an extra rather than and instead of those activities above. But so they came together and announced this end-to-end integrity initiative to try and communicate a more consistent message for companies. The major international crediting standards also published a joint statement on how they plan on collaborating going forward, including around things like Article 6 that we touched on, but also the importance of the Integrity Council and the core carbon principles work. So it really highlighted the ICVCM, is really at the heart of some of these major international VCM developments. And so what does that mean for the future in 2024?
Well, first of all, until these initiatives are fully implemented, we see that there's a lot of buyers who are still very cautious about purchasing carbon credits, and they're kind of waiting until there's more certainty about what is classified as high quality, and then what can they say about their use of carbon credits. We did see the first claim made under the Voluntary Carbon Markets Initiative, which was by Bain and Company, who are a consultancy. And they made the highest level of claim. And we should get more information about what the kind of the flexible Scope 3 claim look like that we mentioned. I think it was kind of around the end of Q1, or also no, in the Q1 now, aren't we? So in Q2, we should see the first carbon credits with a core carbon principle certification issued. But they're going to be very few in supply, as I said, just from those project types which are very, they're very confident meet the criteria. But it does mean there's also a bit of a move away from offsetting claims and more of a focus on the kind of co-benefits of, or core benefits of carbon credit that are not related to carbon and non-offsetting claims. So one discussion which is kind of increasingly contested is the idea of compensation. So a company buying and offsetting versus contribution. So a company buying and using to contribute to, for instance, an NDC. So a very different way of looking at carbon credit use. You might have seen the Science Based Target Initiative have published their Beyond Value Chain Mitigation, which is a similar idea that once companies are en route to net zero, they can buy carbon credits, but not for offsetting purposes, but beyond what they call beyond value chain mitigation. Also, we're looking for more convergence between compliance markets. So when we say compliance markets, we mean things like emissions trading schemes and carbon taxes, and the voluntary markets which issue credits. So there's a great example that Singapore has a carbon tax at the moment where companies can opt to buy carbon credits in lieu of paying a tax up to a limit of 5%. And that way, the company saves a bit of money because the carbon credits are cheaper than the tax, but also you get a bit more liquidity in the market. And also, increasingly there's government regulation, and that's both at the host country level. So, for instance, host countries that have major, like Kenya, who have major sources of supply, how can they regulate these markets so that they're fair for them and they don't risk Kenya not being able to achieve its own climate targets? And also around claims. So the EU recently published their some guidance, or sorry, some regulation on claims, which was pretty stringent on what companies can say about their activities, and particularly around terms like carbon neutral. So those things are kind of increasing, and all of that is leading to a bit of a stall in the market, just until there's more certainty for corporates and buyers. And that is all I've got in terms of slides. I haven't had any questions in the chat, or I haven't seen any hands. So I'll stop sharing there. And yeah, out to the floor if there's anything anybody would like to ask. Oh, Kerry, yeah.
Hi, that was a really interesting talk. Thank you, Matt. I have to confess my ignorance, and thus I didn't understand one of the points you were making about, you said it was controversial, the difference between compensation versus contribution,
Yeah.
on the basis of that. Could you just sort of talk me through that in a little bit more detail?
Sure, yeah. it's really interesting, and there's no indication of which way it's going to go. So compensation is essentially you're buying to compensate for your emissions. So you're buying the carbon credit to offset a ton. Whereas a contribution would be, say, the company decides not to say that it's offsetting its own emissions, but would say, I'm buying this carbon credit to contribute to a wider climate target. So, for instance, Netflix could buy a carbon credit from Kenya and say, we're buying for the purpose of contributing to Kenya's nationally determined contribution, rather than our own footprint.
So it's a bit more like CSR branded kind of, we're doing this because we're good people rather than because we have to offset ourselves.
Exactly. And that's why you see a lot of traditionally critical organizations that are critical of carbon markets advocating for that approach. Whereas, people who maybe have a different interest in the carbon market would argue that compensation is more appropriate because that drives a real demand. You can understand where the demand's going to come from, rather than contribution, which is, like you said, could be more like philanthropy.
Yeah, and can I just extend that then, because I can see Pat's got his hand up, but
course,
might that also be linked with this sense of buying things which offer co-benefits? So maybe it's more like, we're looking for some like holistic kind of rounded thing here. We're not specifically focused on the carbon and what particular, return that's going to get. Is that
exactly.
maybe those two things linked?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and that's another kind of conversation. It gets really messy there because carbon credits aren't always very good at demonstrating like actual impact. They may be good at demonstrating reach and things like that, but actually the impact is less easy to say. But yeah, when I mentioned it before, I was talking explicitly about the carbon contributions, at least from that perspective. But that is definitely something that's also increasingly, getting coverage.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
No, I just want to say thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation, Matt. It's an interesting point you just raised about this thing about contributions versus compensation. The Woodland Carbon Code, there's some disagreement about this globally, but our argument is that companies should be able to use offsets and that these are also included towards government climate change targets. And the reason is that if you say to a company, you cannot use this carbon credit as an offset, then they'll say, okay, well, I won't buy it. In which case the government doesn't get the credit reported in its greenhouse gas inventory and it doesn't contribute towards its NDC. And although the NDC is there under the Paris Agreement as a requirement, there's no requirement under the Paris Agreement for you to actually put measures in place to meet your NDC.
Yeah.
And so again, if you take away initiatives, if you say to the Woodland Carbon Code, well, you can't generate offsets, companies therefore reduce their investments, then that's going to reduce the extent to which we meet our NDC. So, but it's a fairly extended discussion that's been had about it. Not everybody agrees with this.
Yeah.
But we think you're interlinked. If you have to accept that what companies do does contribute towards climate change targets. In the same way, really, that companies' activities in the economy contribute towards GDP.
Yeah, it's really interesting conversation. It only seems to have recently gained much attention. But so, for instance, there's a few EU countries have said that a contribution claim is more appropriate. However, to meet a climate target, a company still has to prove that it's compensated or neutralized its emissions at some point. So, how do those two go hand in hand? Yeah, and so I don't think yeah.
So one of the reasons for it is that originally people saw what the voluntary carbon market should do should be over and above anything that governments do.
Yeah.
And so they don't think that they didn't think therefore that the carbon offset in the voluntary carbon market should be allowed to contribute towards government targets.
Yeah.
But the problem we have with that is that the two are inextricably linked.
Yeah.
So if you follow that through, the government will simply get less progress towards its targets, which, you know, at which point we'd say, well, why would we bother running the Woodland Carbon Code? Because it's not helping UK PLC.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's another conversation around double claiming and double counting. So can a company say it's net zero and use those carbon credits, and those carbon credits are also used for the UK to meet its targets?
But the interesting thing there is, the argument we'd make is that all the UK is doing is reporting the activities across the economy. It's not the government's emissions. So if a company reduces its emissions, well, those emissions aren't the government's emissions anyway. All the government's doing is reporting them in its inventory.
Yeah.
So there's no double counting. The company is reporting its emissions reductions, and those are reported in the greenhouse gas inventory in the same way that a company would report its turnover or income, etc. And the government, you know, that's reported in GDP accounts. So it's just different levels of reporting.
Yeah, and I think I would agree. And so, for instance, the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative totally agree as well. The double claiming is not an issue. But there is so I didn't want to talk about Article 6 as such, but there is an option for companies to buy eventually these correspondingly adjusted credits, which could take them outside of country NDCs altogether and country accounting. And again,
one point on that is that we're a purely domestic standard. So one of the reasons for corresponding adjustments is that if you buy a credit from Mexico and use it in this country, then Mexico needs to make a corresponding adjustment to remove that credit from its inventory. But because we're purely UK based, we're saying, well, that we don't need to do it. Yeah.
And that's the great thing about a domestic market and domestic buyers is you remove a lot of these headaches.
Sorry, I'll shut up there. It's
no. It's great
discussion. It's helpful for us.
It's great because obviously I didn't mention much about the Woodland Carbon Code, so it's interesting to hear having these conversations as well. And particularly, I'm not sure if I haven't got any other questions, but I did hear that UK were looking at integrating removals into the emissions trading scheme and how that might work.
There's going to be a consultation where that will be considered shortly, actually.
Oh, sorry, Phoebe. I can't hear you, Phoebe. It doesn't say you're on mute, but it's not yet.
Yeah, sorry. I mean,
perfect.
Yeah, the conversation's getting a bit sort of beyond my understanding now. But Pat, when you said that, so if it's being purchased for compensation reasons to offset it, then that also does contribute to your NDCs. How does that? Because if it's offsetting, it's a sort of net, it's a sum zero, isn't it? I mean, how does that contribute to a overall reduction if you're just offsetting what you're emitting?
Well, the UK's it's net zero. So if the UK wants to reach net zero, it can do two things. It can reduce its emissions, which it needs to do, and what it can't reduce, it can offset. And so it's a combination of those two. And in the greenhouse gas inventory, it both reports the levels of emissions of different sectors, but it also reports the amount of removals in the case of forestry in the atmosphere. So those two are added together. But the point we've been arguing is that if you say to a company which has reported its offset a ton of CO2, if we say to the government, well, you can't then report that in the national account, then that wouldn't sort of reflect what's actually happening.
Okay, I get that. Yeah, but those should really technically be for the stuff that's very hard to abate, shouldn't it?
Oh yes. And that's absolutely right. There should be a company should do everything they can to reduce emissions first before they offset.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And then going back to the presentation towards the end, where you were talking about sort of other reasons that companies might have to purchase credits to do with sort of compliance. Could you, excuse me, could you explain that a little bit more?
In terms of, so like the Singapore tax,
Yeah,
for instance. Yeah. So let me see if I can get. There is so things like carbon tax and the emissions trading schemes require companies, in effect, to buy, or so they pay per ton of carbon that they emit. And so, for instance, the Singapore tax, I think, is $25, a fixed $25 per ton. And so what Singapore have said is that for up to 5% of your emissions, instead of paying the $25, you can buy carbon credits that are approved and eligible under the scheme. And so that way, the companies are incentivized to buy carbon credits, and you know, but only to a small extent. The Singapore is an interesting example, and maybe not the best one to pick, because they allow international carbon credits. But say, for instance, the UK ETS allowed wood and carbon code credits to be used for the same purpose, then in effect you would have companies buying removals which would help the UK achieve its NDC as well. Yeah, is that, sorry Phoebe, you think you're on mute. Sorry, Phoebe, I think you're on mute on this year.
Oh, yeah, sorry. No, okay, I just didn't hear you said if the UK ETS allowed wood and carbon, not that they are. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'm not very, you know, I'm not sure where these conversations are going. But I put in the tax in the chat the Singapore tax, if you're more interested in how that works. But the same principle could apply for an emissions trading scheme, and does in some countries, like I think South Korea is a good example.
Yeah, I guess I'm just interested in kind of alternative motivations to purchase, the alternative drivers to the purchase of carbon credits, apart from offsetting, which is so sort of contentious amongst. I work for a Scottish Environment Link, and we have you know, NGO spectrum of environmental NGOs as members, and we're sort of grappling to get our heads around this topic, with a range of views on.
You're certainly not the only one, so I think.
No, well, I feel, okay, thank you.
I think Garant, did you want to come in with a question? I know you've listed it in the chat.
Thanks. No, it wasn't really a question so much. It's just elaborating a little bit on Pat's point. Just from our perspective at the peatland code, we've got a bit of an issue with the way SBTI kind of classifies things. So it's just kind of raising that awareness. And I guess, Matt, thanks for the presentation. It was really good. I think I'd add a little extra level between before getting to ICBCM. There's also CRUA, which is the International Carbon Offset Reduction Alliance, and that is kind of almost like a half step between getting that kind of fully ICBCM core carbon principles. And I think already you're seeing a lot of companies requiring that. So I think if if there is a lot of work for companies to get the ICBCM, but I think that will still be a really good halfway step for companies getting that accreditation.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And for some standards that have been through the two processes, some have said the ICRERA is more stringent. I'm not sure whether that reflects your experience, but it doesn't seem like the market is appreciating that kind of.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess. But yeah, it was just to raise that awareness about the SBTI. But yeah, I can send links to ICRERA. So they've just actually updated their standard application form to be a lot more in line with the ICBCM. And now they ask for like a conflict of interest, transparency, and everything publicly available. So the hope is that by carbon crediting programs achieving that benchmark, it will kind of give a lot more confidence in the market, which we then hope will unlock a bit of that kind of stagnant price problems. And then the other thing that I guess is a really important piece of work is the price. So a lot of the price is really confidential between the buyer and the seller. So being able to have a little bit more transparency on price, we're doing a lot of work together with the Woodland Carbon Code to try and have some of that price disclosed anonymously. But I think that will really help the market if we can start having that price.
Yeah. Thanks, James. Sorry, Kerry.
Well, it's not really a question, but I was really interested to see from your talk how active the UK is in shaping this. I hadn't quite taken that on board. I knew within the UK, of course, there's a lot of work and things being commissioned by DEFRA and others. And I guess I was kind of like, so I guess it's consistent. It makes sense. Is it this? I mean, I'm curious to know, is there kind of the same set of people who are, so like the work on the BSI standards, obviously that's done by the BSI, but it's very closely hand in glove with the UK administrations and DEFRA in particular. Is there a kind of a core group of people who are very much involved in this, do you think, or regardless of the kind of level at which it plays out?
I can't speak, so I can't speak for the BSI part. So I know the ICVCM, the Integrity Council, that came from, I would say, the Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets, which after COP26. And so a lot of people have remained consistent, but it's mostly, I'd say, international carbon market players, but the UK government has funded a lot of the initial work, maybe because of COP26, but I think others in the group might be more able to confirm that than I am. But the two initiatives are also working very closely together as well.
Well, that's good to know. At least we don't have things happening in parallel.
Yeah.
As an outsider, it's sometimes, it's hard to get your head around it, and it's hard to know whether do these things connect or not. So knowing that somebody else is connected, it kind of gives me some reassurance. I've got to go now, but thank you very much for the talk.
Thanks, Gary.
Thanks, Renee and Pat, for adding more comments in the chat. Doesn't seem to be any other questions, so we could close here, Matt, if there's any kind of closing comments. If not, then just remains for me to say thank you to Matt and thank you to all of you for joining us. If there are any outstanding questions, you can contact Matt through the Basecamp or post a question on the Basecamp. This recording should be available shortly after we close or tomorrow. And do sign up for the Basecamp if you haven't already. And we look forward to seeing you at any future webinars. So thanks for joining. Goodbye for now.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Yeah.